Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, welcome. We are Erin McClyman and Denis Didier Rousseau on behalf of Odile Perron, today's conveners of this webinar, the fifth in a series organized by Climate of the Past on one of the journal's topics. This series is part of the journal's celebration of its 20th anniversary of successful leadership. The webinar will last for 1 hour with two presentations of half an hour and conclude with half an hour audience Q&A to be asked only in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And all the webinars are recorded and uploaded to the EGU YouTube channel thanks to EGU office. So today's topic is impact of past climate changes on ecosystems and human societies, which provide historical perspectives for modern climate adaptation and resilience strategies. I think a good timing with the current COP30, which is hosted in Brazil. To address this topic, we have selected two guest speakers, Gustav Strandberg from the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute and Bronwen Whitney from Northumbria University. Erin.
Thanks, Denis. So let us first introduce Gustav. Gustav's field of work considers the evaluation of regional and global climate simulations and uncertainties in climate scenarios. So this work includes paleoclimate studies and the role of other forcing other than greenhouse gas forcing, as well as information to the general public and users of climate scenario data. Today, Gustav will speak about human land use as a climate forcing during the Holocene. Over to you, Gustav.
Thank you. And just give me a few seconds to share my screen. So there we go. So thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate this. And yeah, what I will present now is a part of my research and a little bit summing up what I have done in this field over the last 10 years or so. And yes, as we just heard, this is about human land use as a climate forcing during the Holocene. And I have not done this myself, of course, so I mention quite a lot of co-authors that have been with me during this time. So if we start here looking at how the European landscape has changed over the Holocene, this graph shows ago on the y-axis from 12,000 years ago up until today, and then we have openness in the landscape on the x-axis. So in the beginning of Holocene, when the ice disappeared, it left behind a very open landscape, and then gradually the forests were expanding and more covering the European continent. So around 6,000 years ago, we had the maximum forest coverage in Europe during this time period. And at about that time, humans started to have an influence on the vegetation. So cutting down trees for wood or for grazing or for making hunting easier. And since then, the openness has increased again up until today. So this must have had an effect on the European climate, since we know that the land cover interacts with the atmosphere. And today we will focus on the two time periods 6,000 years ago and 2,500 years ago. And before we go into that, we will just have a look at why is this important. So on the global scale, this is kind of straightforward. So if you cut down the forests, you will emit CO2 to the atmosphere, which will give you an increased greenhouse effect and increased temperatures. And the other way around if the forest expands. So this global geochemical effect is quite straightforward and easy to describe, but on the local scale, this is not as simple. So just to exemplify this, so to the left we see a forest, and in the forest we have low albedo and high evapotranspiration, whereas in open land or grasslands we have high albedo and low evapotranspiration. This means that in the case of deforestation, so deforestation is that you cut away forest. So deforestation gives us higher albedo, which gives us lower temperature. It also gives less evapotranspiration, which gives higher temperature. So we know that changes the landscape has an effect, but we can't know exactly what that effect is on the really local scale. And these are the biogeophysical effects on climate. So to try to understand this a little bit more, we were looking at simulating climate in climate models with different descriptions of the land cover. And you can get past land covers in different ways. So you can reconstruct the land cover using pollen data, and that kind of gives you the actual vegetation, or as it was. So this is the pollen reflects the vegetation as it was at some particular point in time. But then we can't know if this is influenced by anthropogenic activity or not. So we only know that this is how the vegetation was at this time. We can also model vegetation with the dynamical vegetation model. And from that, we get a vegetation that is consistent with the climate, but also undisturbed. So the potential vegetation, as we call it, so without any interference. So if vegetation were allowed to grow freely, this is what it would look like. And then in the studies that I will show here, the assumption is that the difference between reconstructed and simulated vegetation is explained by anthropogenic activities, at least when it comes to the openness. It's a little bit more difficult when we start to talk about the proportion of different tree types and things like that, so I will not go into that. So here we only say that the difference in openness, or the forest cover, if you will, is explained by anthropogenic activities. So we start here at 2,500 years ago, and what we did is the following. So we start with the global climate model Easy Earth, and from that model we get a description of the climate at 2.5 K. That climate is then forced in the dynamical vegetation model LPJ GESS. And from that, we get a potential land cover consistent with the climate from the global model. But the global model only gives us a coarse picture of Europe, but we want something more detailed. So we simulate 2.5 K climate in regional climate models. And then we had two different RCMs, so RCA4 and HCLIM. And then we force the RCMs with the GCM on the boundaries and with the vegetation from LPJ GESS. And that gives us two simulations of 2.5 K climate. In parallel, we reconstructed the land cover using pollen data and the reveals method. And then we have both a potential land cover from LPJ GESS and a reconstructed land cover from reveals. And then we can use the reconstructed land cover in the regional climate models in the same way, using the same background data, forcing data from the global model. That gives us two additional simulations of 2.5 K climate. So I hope you still follow me here. It's a bit much to handle here, but still. And just to simplify this a lot, to say what is the difference here, then I just show you the difference in openness between the reconstructed and the LPJ GESS, so simulated vegetation. And then we see that the reconstructed vegetation is much more open. So we have more openness in more or less entire Europe. It's only in the far east side where we have more forests in the reconstructed land cover than in the simulated. So this is the difference that we kind of use in the simulations of climate to see what is the impact of this change in forest cover. And I will now take you through this, what we see, and try to explain that in as simple as I can. So one thing is that, and as I said this before, that if you change vegetation, you will also change the albedo. And here is what we see, that albedo in the two different regional climate models. So RCA4 on the left and HCLIM to the right, in winter now. And as albedo is more or less directly, or a direct effect of the vegetation, you see that these two maps are very similar. So it doesn't really matter what model you use, because it's the same description of vegetation. So it's a very clear relation between albedo and vegetation. And this also means that the response in temperature will also be very similar in the two models. So here we see the difference in temperature in spring, March, April, May, when we compare the simulated climate using reconstructed land cover and simulated potential land cover. So these are the difference between the simulations. So it's not the difference between different time periods. So we are still at 2.5 K. And then we see that the temperature response here is directly connected to the albedo changes. And as we saw before, we have, with more openness, we have higher albedo, which gives us lower temperature. So we can understand that. So it's a clear relationship here. If we instead then look at summer temperatures, the picture is not that simple. It's a bit more complicated here. And now I should say that the grid boxes that are colored here are those that show significant differences. So it's not that white here means that we don't have any signal. It's only that the signal is not significant. But still, we see to the left here that in RCA we have a much more strong response to the land cover changes, with a temperature, or warmer temperature of 1 to 1.5 degrees in large parts of Central and Western Europe. Whereas in HCLIM to the right, we don't, more or less don't have an effect. But I can just say this as a side note, that the sign of the change here is actually the same. It's only that it's not that significant. So the response here is much more model dependent. So it's not that easy to say what does vegetation changes actually mean for the climate. And if we try to understand this, then we can have a look at the latent heat flux and how that changes when we change vegetation. And then we see that RCA to the left have a strong, or at least a clear reduction in the latent heat flux. So here we see the latent heat flux. And if we have less latent heat flux, we will have more sensible heat and therefore also higher temperature. So we can see how this is connected. And in HCLIM to the right, we don't have as strong response in latent heat flux, and therefore we don't have such a strong response in temperature. So we can also understand why this is happening. So this response is much more model dependent, and this comes down to the land surface scheme in the climate models and what parameterizations are made there. And these could be things like leaf area index, root depth, or how moisture is transported from the lower soil layers up to the vegetation, things like this, which is not that straightforward to describe, and you can understand why these things are described in different ways in different models. So to sum up this first part, so we can say that there are reasons to believe that the anthropogenic land cover changes that were in around this time at 2,500 years ago were probably large enough to have an impact on the climate already at this time. Depending on which model you choose, this impact is stronger or weaker. But then again, I just have to point that out, that both of these models give actually an increased temperature. It's only that the signal is weaker in HClim. So there are reasons to believe that there is an anthropogenic effect already now on the climate, at least in summer in the southern and western parts of Europe, where we know that there were actually quite a lot of human activities. The story is quite different in Scandinavia. There we have to look for other explanations, because we know that there were no large settlements or anything around there at that time. And just to explain this a little bit more, showing that the models are not that different, or that you can understand why they are different. So now these are annual cycles of albedo in the top row, latent heat flux in the center, and temperature in the bottom row. And then we have Scandinavia to the left, West Central Europe in the middle, and Iberian Peninsula on the right. And then if we start looking here at West Central Europe, we can see that in both these models, the response to land cover changes are kind of the same. So we see that, so the hashed lines are with the reconstructed vegetation. So with more openness, we get more latent heat flux, but they come from different levels, and that have some kind of effect. And on the Iberian Peninsula, we see even larger differences in the annual cycle. So in RCA, the black lines here, we see that soil moisture is depleted quite early in spring already, and then it doesn't matter anymore if we have so the latent heat flux is not, or evapotranspiration is not an effect anymore, because we don't have any soil moisture. So then it's albedo anyway that decides on what response you will have on temperature. And then since we saw this at 2,500 years ago, it's interesting to see how far can we have an effect on this. So and when we did this, we have a little bit more elaborate procedure actually. So here we started with the global model and took the climate from that, forcing the two regional climate models. And from those models, we then forced the vegetation model, giving us two simulations of 6K vegetation. So then we have two LPJ guess simulations of vegetation, and I call them here L1 and L2, and you can see that they are generally the same, but you can also see that there are some slight differences between them. So there is not one description of 6K vegetation or simulated, because it little bit depends on even small differences in climate could have an effect that you can actually see here. And I will not go into all the details here, but then since we had two descriptions of vegetation and two regional climate models, we then get 4 simulations of 6K climate with different combinations of land cover and climate model. And then as in the same way as before, in parallel, we reconstructed land cover using pollen-based methods in reveals and the KK10 land cover. And then we have these 3 different, so we have 2 potential, L1 and L2, and then the reconstructed vegetation in R here. And you can see that the kind of pattern is the same, but we have more openness in the reconstructed forest fraction. So here is only the forest fraction. So again, only looking at the amount of openness. And now we also, so then we have more combinations of land cover and models, so we have more maps, but the basic principles are the same. So I will not explain them thus thoroughly. So it's kind of the same. You can see that the albedo is directly connected to vegetation. So there's a clear correlation there, and also the response. But the response, the amplitude of the response can differ between the models. And again, for evapotranspiration is the main factor that explains the temperature response in summer. And you can see here that you see both differences in the response in evapotranspiration and temperature. So then here we see again that this is a little bit more than linked to how the model actually works, and not only the description of the land cover. So to start to sum this up, so we can see that vegetation is an important climate forcing, and regardless if we think that this had an anthropogenic vegetation changes had an effect on climate of the past, we still, at least you should be convinced that vegetation is an important climate forcing. So you should have, when you simulate the climate in the past or in the future, you should have a realistic vegetation that is consistent with the climate that you are simulating. Because even small changes in the vegetation could have an effect that is at least significant. And based on our results, there are reasons to believe that anthropogenic land cover changes actually had an effect on temperature at least in winter in southern Europe. And again, so it's important to use land covers that are realistic. And now, since I have a little bit time left, I also want to say something about pointing into the future. So talking about climate of the past and past land covers, if we look into the future, we know now that human activity directly affects more than 70% of the global ice-free land areas. So that's quite a lot. And the pathways consistent with limiting global warming to at most 2 degrees require land-based mitigation and land use change. So if we want to reach these targets, we know that the European landscape and also landscape in other continents have to change in the future. And now when we looked at this will not only have an effect on the global climate via the biogeochemical effects, but it will also have local effects through these biogeophysical effects. And those are not that well known, as I showed here. They are much more uncertain. The difference between models are much more larger. So it could be that we have some unwanted effects on the local scale from this in the future. And yes, that was what I wanted to present to you this afternoon. So thanks a lot for listening. I hope I made myself clear and was not too confusing. And in the end, I will just like to mention the most important papers that was the foundation for this talk. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, Gustav. Yeah, that was a really fascinating talk, and really interesting to see your perspectives from the past and also thinking about the future. Just a reminder for the audience that we're going to take questions of both speakers at the end of the webinar. So please, if you have questions for Gustav, please use the Q&A box that you can see on the Zoom link. Also, if you see a question that someone else has already asked and you're interested in, it's possible to vote for that and push it up the priority list. So we'll ask Gustav questions after our second speaker. Okay, so now let's introduce Bronwyn Whitney to you. After studying climate and vegetation change from the last glacial period until present in the world's largest tropical wetland in Bolivia, Bronwyn continued her research into human and climatic causes of tropical environmental change since her appointment at Northumbria University. Today, Bronwyn will speak to us about complex societal responses to climate and environmental change in the tropical Americas. Over to you, Bronwyn.
So as Erin pointed out, I'm a tropical paleoecologist, and my specialism is human and climatic drivers of change. And so I've chosen as this title page an illustration which shows the magnitude of past landscape engineering in the tropics. This is from the Amazon, and I'm going to speak more about this particular study a little bit later on in the talk. But to begin with, why would we be interested in past human-environment interactions? Well, we have had scenarios where climate change has been aligned to past societal collapse, and these narratives have the tendency to gloss over adaptive land use and management strategies. And in doing so, it somewhat downplays the role of traditional practices in a sustainable future. And I think this follows on really nicely from what Gustav was saying about preservation of forests. So how people managed ecosystems and landscapes is fundamental to understanding both this and also what is natural in tropical environments. In many cases, we're looking at hundreds and thousands of years of past human modification and engineering when we're looking at modern ecosystems. And so understanding those human influences is really important if we're going to conserve them. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about this complex interaction between people and climate through ecosystem engineering. And I'm going to use a lot of cartoons because I'm a palynologist and I appreciate very much that nobody wants to have their retinas burned out by pollen diagrams. But in all cases, I will be presenting the references at the bottom of the slides should you want to see the data yourself. And as a first example, I think if we consider the impact of climate change on ancient societies, this is really epitomized by the example of the ancient Maya. And it even made the cover of Jared Diamond's 2005 book on collapse and how societies have been influenced by past climate change. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the narrative, basically the story is that poor environmental stewardship and vulnerability to climate droughts meant that it sort of hastened the demise of the ancient Maya civilization about 1,000 years AD. And you can see from the graph on the right that shows a generalized trend, climate trend, like a regional composite for the lowlands, Maya lowlands, and that you can see where that period leading up to the collapses had several droughts, where basically the terminal collapse is about 1100 AD. And this story also comes out in pollen diagrams particularly. So this one on the left is from a pollen diagram around Chichén Itzá in Guatemala, and it shows basically pollen, tree pollen crashing as the Maya were building quite considerable temples and intensifying their land use up until that point of collapse, followed by an increase in forest again. Cook and others also took this further, and they looked at land cover changes and sort of interpolated in between the pollen diagrams and concluded that during pre-Columbian times, the reduction of forest cover exacerbated drought through disruption of the hydrological cycle. So all of these studies really are based in paleoenvironmental studies. And really, there's been a strong narrative of forest clearances, soil degradation, and as I've pointed out, poor environmental stewardship, such that the modeled forest land cover back in the Maya times was less than it is in the post-industrial times. But that's not the only story. There's certainly a lot of protagonists like in the literature, like Annabelle Ford, who has pointed out that actually no, people relied on a lot more on a polyculture system, which allowed for an intact canopy. It preserved soil structure. It didn't disrupt the hydrological cycle in such a way. And there's more of a mixed resource use, not this focus on maize and big fields of maize, as you might think of if you think of like the Midwest US. The thing about her research is it's grounded in modern ethnographic understanding, which is very much how the Maya currently grow crops today, but it doesn't have that temporal dimension. So we see this real tension in the literature between these two viewpoints. The other thing too that sort of complicates the story is that at the time of the ancient Maya collapse, of course, the southern lowlands it saw political disintegration and a lot of abandonment of cities. But in the northern lowlands, so where we have this darker gray picture in this map from Turner and Sabloff and PNAS, it shows actually there was growth during this period. So although things were getting drier, in the north the drought wasn't as strong, but still it was still a drought, and we saw a growth in that area. So the story is quite complicated, and one thing that we don't really look at in detail, or I argue has not been looked at in detail, is land use and how people manage their resource, rather than just these more, I guess, end member arguments about past landscape. So I'm going to present 3 stories in rapid succession. One of them is from Lamanai, which is a prominent temple site. It's near river and lagoon, and it's on the boundary of that collapse area. Basil Jones, which is out on the coast, it's an island site. There's dry forest in it now, so it's kind of in the hinterlands. And finally, Lamanai, finally Esmeralda, which is in an area of low to medium density, no immediate temple sites nearby, but a fairly substantial archaeological region. So if we look at Lamanai, which is along New River Lagoon in Belize, it's, as I pointed out, it's on the boundary of collapse, but it also didn't collapse in a traditional sense. It was still occupied until about 1280 AD. And it's on a kind of quite complex mosaic landscape, as you can see from that land cover map. There's a lot of pine savannas, which are in the orange, and on the other side, broadleaf forest. And modern day, there's a lot of agricultural uses in the area, and it is currently a protected area, hence the reason why there's a lot of forest. There are 2 records from this particular lake, and we've been able to splice them together to also sort of show a spatial complexity in how people were using this area at the time. So again, no pollen diagrams, but cartoons. So I'm going to show you a composite record of both sort of like this site that's near the temple, and then about, I'd say about a kilometer and a half away from that, there's a post-colonial, post-classic and colonial site. And so this starts off as a pollen record, starting to follow sort of like the classic pattern of the early to mid pre-classic, where we see occupation of the area, burning, some forest clearance, some cultivation, and we see pine being exploited in the lowland savannas. This is followed on by up to the late pre-classic, where we see construction actually starting to begin in the temple areas. And the really interesting thing about this is we start seeing palms pop up in the records in concentrations that we just would not otherwise expect. And so we see crop cultivation along with these palms, but still some of the original forest left. And that forest goes down to its lowest level in the intensified construction period. And in the early to post-classic, we see palm management kind of exploding, but also some forest remaining. So it looks like we've got really quite a strong mixed land use signal happening. The pines are almost completely gone at this point, but the palms are really, which are living in a different area, basically have gone through the roof. This is also really important because the whole period, it covers this area of various droughts, including the big droughts that led up to the collapse at the end. And yet we see continuous land cover and continuous land use during this time. And then finally, following the post-classic area, we see people kind of drifting away from temple sites, which we're probably not surprised by given the cultural changes. We see biodiversity increasing, and in the surrounding area and more toward the colonial sites to the south, more of a forest garden model of use, very much like Annabelle Ford has purported, and forest regrowth in savannas. So we don't see any sort of really, strictly complicated pattern of land use change aligning to both the Maya periods and the actual droughts themselves. If we look further afield, so we get away from the temples. And I mean, this is one of the really key things about land use across this area, is that one of the earliest archaeologists pointed out that, you know, we're focusing on the Reims and York of Maya sites, and we really need to get out into those hinterlands to really understand the land cover and what people were actually doing. And so if we go way out to the coast towards Ambergris Caye, which is the largest island in Belize, and it's got the only archaeological reserve, island reserve of Maya historic importance. And it was occupied from the early pre-classic, sorry, the late pre-classic into the post-classic, and it was known as the salt production site. So people were there. We knew they were there for a long time, but there's no large monumental building, and it's basically out in the hinterlands. What's really interesting about this, and I'm showing you a charcoal record here now with the little orange triangles showing where we have strong cultivation signals, is that where we have some of the biggest droughts at the end of the classic period, and modern day is to the left on this diagram, we see that fire really, really increases alongside evidence of occupation at these points of drought. And we think that this is very strongly a signal of post-classic migration away from the temple site. So we're seeing where people are going. So we have almost continuous forest cover during much of this period, but some pressures really putting on the forest at the point where we can see internal migration around the Yucatan. So despite the fact that we know that people were, you know, dispersed during the post-classic, we don't really have evidence somewhat of where they go because of the lack of temple sites in the post-classic. So this is a really nice evidence of where people are going and how they're using their forest in this new world. And then finally, just to remind you where the sites are, if we go up to Esmeralda, which is up in the north, it's in Mexico now, and it's in a medium density sort of site. This is really nice because it has a paired lake that's next to it. That is one of the classic Maya, like classic sites of the classic Maya droughts during this particular period in Esmeralda. And again, on the left, we can see the two lake sites. They're these long, skinny lakes that are formed in the geological fault in the Yucatan. Esmeralda is down at the bottom, and it's actually quite tiny. It's about 100 meters, 200 meters wide at that particular point where we record. So for those of you who are palynologists, you know that means that it's probably quite a local signal. Chichancanab, yes, it's long and skinny. We don't think of that as being part of the pollen catchment, but the width is important, and it's about 6 times the width of Esmeralda. So we think we've got a nice mix of like paired lake construction where we can look at a much sort of like an extra local versus a super local site, and helps us to disentangle what land use immediately and land use more broadly is looking like. And again, we've got cartoons of what's happening with these two particular lake sites. The top is Chichancanab, the larger one. The bottom is Esmeralda, which is the smaller one. And Chichancanab shows a fair amount of opening of canopy throughout this period, the late classic and into the terminal classic, and it shows that classic sequence of, you know, forest pressures followed by people just kind of dispersing. But interestingly, Esmeralda, as a local site, it would only really pick up land use immediately in that area, is showing cultivation at that terminal classic drought. And what we think, because they align, this is the only time in the two records where we see cultivation happening in both, and they're aligning at that point. Again, we're thinking that we see inwards migration into this area and where people have dispersed into forest areas and possibly using, again, polyculture at this point. So again, very different to the temple sites if we look in these hinterlands as to what people are doing. So just quickly to draw a line under this point of the talk, we can say that environmental change doesn't neatly align with cultural periods, and nor does it neatly align with this necessarily with the droughts as well. We have paleoecological data that supports polyculture crop production. And basically what we're saying is that there is such spatial variation across the peninsula and in the Maya lowlands. We just don't really have this captured adequately. We see evidence of forest conservation under periods of environmental and climatic stress. And this array of sampling going out into the hinterland shows us what people are doing at this point of political disintegration and internal migration, which we just simply cannot see in the archaeological record. So that moving on, so next to the Amazon, which is a very, very different situation. The Amazon has, I guess, theoretically been considered to be a place of low density human occupation for many, many years. And a lot of this comes out of Betty Meggers's work. She's an American anthropologist from the mid-last century. And Betty Meggers called the Amazon a counterfeit paradise. Basically that it was green and it was lush, but it couldn't, you know, with a Malthusian sort of perspective, she argued that you couldn't support many large populations because of the thinness of the soils and, you know, because of the lack of cultivation in these sorts of very wet environments. The last 20, 30 years, there's been quite a paradigm shift in how we view what people used to do in the Amazon and how they used to manage them in the past. Particularly with Bill Denovan's work, where he highlighted the extent and magnitude of past agricultural systems and crop production systems from across the Americas, which is shown here in this map in green. And it shows, of course, that the entirety of the Amazon being covered. And as more forest, Amazon rainforest, unfortunately, is chopped down. We're seeing, you know, in recent years, we've seen more and more evidence of some of these quite substantial modifications that existed in the past. Of course, LiDAR is making this a lot better, so you don't have to cut down the trees. So yes, there's been a wholesale sort of change in how we view what people used to manage in the past. And if we go to where I've done some work with my archaeology colleagues in Southwest Amazonia, a place called Llanos de Mojos and the Beni Savannas. This is a section of Brazil, this is a section of Amazonia, which is northern, sort of the junction of northern Bolivia and southern Brazil. And it's where the rainforest meets savannas, and it's a really complex area. There's lots of different ecosystem types. There's a real diversity of people as well, a diversity of languages. And it's also a place where you see a significant cultivation or domestication of many plant species. This diagram on the left shows the numbers of earthworks, so landscape modifications that we have seen throughout this particular region. And Clark Erickson's picture on the right just shows like, sort of like a composite of the different types of landscapes that exist, although you don't see them all pushed together like this. This is like it's an imaginary landscape. Certainly, the map on the left shows the diversity of where they are in space. Anyway, nonetheless, there is a lot of landscape engineering. And where I'm focusing is in the savanna region, which is, as I pointed out, it's called the Llanos de Mojos. And particularly, I work in an area with raised fields. And so for those of you who are familiar with maybe rig and furrow fields in northern Britain, they don't look that dissimilar from an oblique angle. They are for management of water and food production, and you can really quite see them nicely from the air. There's also many other things like causeways, canals, various other water modifications in this particular region. Because it is a seasonally flooded savanna, things are super flat, and control of floodwater is absolutely important for crop production, for transport, for many, many reasons. You do get some trees, and they tend to be elevated on higher terrain and along riparian zones. The huge numbers of the studies that I'm going to present have come from here, which is an enormous wetland and an old paleo channel in the Llanos de Mojos. It's the Canato wetlands, and you can see where the raised fields are sort of running into that wetland, which makes me think that, you know, water levels have changed in recent years. There are forest islands nearby, and these are the slightly higher terrain that people have used for habitation. And also just recently characterized from across this region from my archaeology colleague who works in conjunction with the paleo work, John Walker, has pointed out all of these what we call relic fish weirs. But basically they're very, very tiny elevated sections that people have created to divert water. And we think that they're using this to divide land into wet and dry, and basically control floodwaters for modification, for their own purposes. So this, however, is all happening at the backdrop of Holocene climate change. And so we don't have really good dates on the archaeology, but we know that people have been modifying things for a good 3,000–4,000 years from whatever dates that we do have. And if we look at what climate is doing in this period, things are getting wetter. There's not a really good composite climate diagram for this part of the world, so I just kind of stuck some together, and forgive the fact that this is clearly an Excel diagram. But the Amazonian rainforest pollen in Southwest Amazon is going up because the rainforest boundary is descending across this period. From the Pantanal just to the east of us, we can see lake levels rising. This is an algal reconstruction beginning around 3,000 years ago. The best record out there is still in the Andes. So, we're talking about quite high elevation, but Lake Titicaca sees its low stand end at 4,000 years ago, with benthic diatoms basically disappearing from the records, and then an increase in planktonic ones in the last 2,000 years or so. So multiple proxies, multiple locations are all showing the same thing. We can just say, broadly speaking, it has been getting wetter over the last 3,000 to 4,000 years in this part of the world. So this is particularly interesting for a place that has quite, it's really flat and it seasonally floods. Basically, the floods are getting worse during this period. So we have 4 cores from across the Kanata wetlands, which is shown here in the orange dots. Across the wetlands itself, which is around 20 miles end to end. All of the other colors laid on top of this satellite imagery are indications of where the archaeological works are. And there's 2 other sets of records here. There's one that I have not been involved with the study of, which is a very large lake up to the top left, which gives us a really nice regional signal as to what's going on, and that contextualizes our archaeology. And I'll talk about the oxbows in a second. So we have these 4 cores. And if we look at the fire reconstructions, particularly in this part of the world, we see some really interesting things happening. So this is a micro charcoal record from Brugger and others, and it shows that basically regional fires kind of ended about 5,000 years ago, and the charcoal records just completely drop off. And that's understandable. That's when things start to get wetter in the region. And then in the last 1,500 or so years, we do get some sort of increase in char. A lot of that will be post-European land use change as well. So we see this generalized picture across this region. If we look at the individual charcoal records that we have for those orange dots, they're not all perfect because they're not all covering the Holocene, and one of them, ME, has a bit missing at the top, and the shading shows where we have data. So this comes with a kind of the pinch of salt that not everything is complete. But we can see that the records of fire, increased fire abundance, does not align in any of these records. It doesn't align with the generalized climate trend, and it doesn't align with the overall regional pattern of burning. Not really. And so we have this really interesting story where all of these sites, which are located right next to habitation mounds, forest islands, not habitation mounds, raised fields and whatnot, represents different land use change and different signals happening at different times. So we've got about 4,500 years of land management, of people moving around and doing some patchwork management. And actually, we see this in greater detail if we look at 2 of these cores in much greater proxy detail. So in these records, which we have published, we have fire for charcoal, we have phytoliths, which are in situ forest and savanna vegetation. We have diatoms, and we also have pollen. So we've just kind of whacked everything at these 2 cores. And this is my only pollen diagram, forgiveness. And so we see very similar things. So this is the Mercedes core, which is more further down. Like it's not highly resolved, but it's much older. And we can see that there's a period in the past where the phytoliths are showing that there's more trees. And we've interpreted those phytoliths to reflect a seasonally inundated dry forest. These things definitely exist in this part of the world. So that's these bits down here. And this is where we think that we've got a seasonal flood happening. We have no diatoms in the records. The lithology is very inorganic. And then somewhere around this point where I have shaded, we see fire increase, but at the same time, evidence of permanent wetland creation, because the trees themselves also have gone, which would have been a seasonally flooded environment. It's such a contradiction in terms. And this is where we think they have started to divide terrestrial and hydrological, sorry, terrestrial and aquatic environments more permanently with the use of floodwater management. So 1700 BCE, I think we have clearance of flooded in forest and then division into more terrestrial and aquatic spaces with creation of greater water resources. And then seeing the exact same pattern, but at completely different timings in the other record. We've since fleshed this out with more data, and we're seeing, if anything, detail, but it's holding in this particular pattern. So this is where this image comes from. It shows a reconstruction of the Kanato wetlands, where people have, made more permanent wetlands in the past, and that we've got this patchwork modifications happening in time and space. And this is all happening at the backdrop of rising precipitation. So it's no surprise that people are controlling things to make their environment more useful. And that this wetland management strategy was part of a holistic land use strategy, because wetlands will give you a lot. They will give you green manure for your fields. So that's aquatic plants. There's fish, there's Muscovy duck, which is the only animal that has been really properly domesticated in the Amazon, as well as irrigation and transportation. And we're still working on this wetlands, and we're still finding more interesting things coming out of it. And then finally, briefly, as I pointed out, I would talk about those pink dots as well. So these are lakes that are on a river channel up near just sort of north of the wetlands by about 40 kilometers. And this is El Cerro. And El Cerro is an enormous hill. This is it here from satellite imagery. It's about 10 hectares. It's covered in raised fields, or surrounded by raised fields. And it's surrounded by higher forested terrain that doesn't sustain flooding. Currently, El Cerro is a ranch. But back in the day, back pre-Columbian times, we knew that it was being farmed, and there's polyculture happening because of the abundant dark earths in the area as well. So we had two records of pollen and charcoal to combine, and they just those two records just match each other. They're very close in scale and overlapping. And just to give you an idea of what El Cerro looks like between flood and drought, this is it from the oblique level. And this is an extreme flood year, but nonetheless, this is the sort of landscape management that is required in this very flat environment. So what do our two records show us? Well, they show us that from about 300 to 1200 AD, there's a lot of burning and savanna management, and we think that's when they were creating the raised fields and using those raised fields for crop cultivation, maize among other crops. Between 1200 and 1500 CE, there seems to be a shift towards more forest management, and something crops out of the records, which is Inga, which is the ice cream bean, and a potential companion planter because it's a legume, and so it improves soil, but it also stabilizes soil. So we see this shift towards like a more complex planting happening at that particular time. Of course, the European encounter saw, so much depopulation due to disease and genocide in this area. So we see that sort of transformation happening in the last 500 years as well. What's really interesting is that the closest records we have is the speleothem from the Andes. And if you look at that period of forest polyculture, it aligns with a period of drought in the local speleothem records. basically we've got the Little Ice Age is a little bit wetter, top going up is older. I've had to reverse the scale this way. And so the Little Ice Age, which is down near the bottom, is wetter, but also there's a wetter medieval climate anomaly here too as well. And so in between the two, we've got this period of a bit of drought. And basically it suggests that people are using the fields and the forest, and they're doing a mix of different types of management, but that basically this flexible mix allows them to change depending on the mean flood conditions of the time. So just to summarize, wind up here. So in the MOHOs, we see that, again, we have really sophisticated land use strategies, and in this case, it's for water. We have flexible strategies that are adapted to both wet and dry conditions, and they seem to be happening in very tight spatial scales. 40 kilometers is not enormous. And these mixed models, I guess, can be adopted and picked up depending on what is the mean climate of the time. And that wetlands appear to be something we cannot disregard, particularly when we're talking about past land use, is how wetlands fit into this mix of crop production and material production. So yes, just to finally point out that I guess my key thesis is that reconstructions of past land use are absolutely necessary to understand this link between societal change and climate. That we see these flexible and adaptive land use strategies during periods of past climate change, and that we see different strategies that are highly variable in all examples. And so, you know, drawing huge, I guess, extrapolations from individual sites is not helpful. I hate to be that person who says we need more data, but we need more data. We need to look carefully at what we're studying and the spatial scale that it represents. And then particularly to point out that the drought, decline, wet growth dichotomy of societal, I guess, response is really oversimplified. And it's particularly not useful when we're dealing with these flooded environments. So thank you for listening. And these are all of the people who have contributed to all of this research. And of course, the people of Belize and Bolivia. So thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn. That was also, a fascinating talk, bringing together some climate, land use, impact on humans and vice versa. So just to the audience, the floor is open for questions. Please use the Q&A box, and Denis and I will keep an eye on the questions coming in so that we can put them to our two speakers. So please use that Q&A box and also upvote questions which have already been asked if you see something that you would particularly like to query the speakers on.
So there was one question which has been raised about the use of phytoliths and pollens, but in rock records. But I think that Owen has already replied, but maybe she could elaborate on that. I'm not sure that everybody knows what phytoliths are. So maybe can you explain exactly what kind of beast it is?
Sorry. Yes, I should have explained that. Phytoliths are the silica bodies that are kind of accumulate in the intercellular spaces of plants, and particularly a lot of plants need that silica structure in order to stand upright. A lot of things like grasses and palms particularly need silica because they don't have wood as part of their structure. So when those plants die and they get they degrade into the environment, the silica tends to hang around. In fact, silica those silica bodies are really robust compared to pollen a lot of the times. But there is a bit of a problem in that phytoliths are really diagnostic with certain groups of plants, like I said, grasses, sedges, palms. There's a lot of the dicotyledons, so basically the woody plants that we can't differentiate using phytoliths. We can say, broadly speaking, arboreal or not arboreal. But that being said, they're really complementary with pollen, so they're great to kind of put them together. Can we see climate shifts with them? It's one of these things that I will always say it depends on the scale. I was actually quite surprised, a scale and magnitude. I was quite surprised at the Laguna Esmeralda record, which is in the north central Mexico. I didn't expect to ever see any vegetation response to what I think was climate forcing during this time, because they are such anthropogenic forests. You know, like, people have engineered them so much that I wouldn't have expected to see a clear climate signal. But in that case, I actually did. I didn't mention it, but there's a section in the middle of that late terminal classic drought where we do actually see a response of the vegetation. But the problem is always that people, if it's a really heavily human modified area, extracting those signals is very difficult. It's always best to have an independent climate record, is always my argument. Although, again, talk about scale, if you go very far back in time where we know people are not around, then pollen can be an excellent proxy for climate change. It just really depends what people are up to, as always.
Yeah, thank you. So there is another question, but I don't know if, maybe it would be interesting. It's, I'm sorry if this is off topic, but I am a level student who is thinking of going into geology, and I'm very interested in your day-to-day job, and also what a lot of how you do your research looks like. Gustav, for example?
Yeah, sure. I'm not a geologist, so I can't really tell you how that is, but I can certainly tell you that also meteorology and climate science is really interesting. So I think you can choose different paths. And I am also working at the governmental agency, so that makes it a little bit special. So I do research, and that could sometimes be running a model or looking at data, doing statistical analysis. But it could also be talking to other agency or the general public about climate change and what that could mean for, or more direct impacts on society or city planning or whatever. So it could be very different things. But yes, it's very, very interesting and fun. So please.
So Brian?
Yeah, so again, I'm not a geologist. I come from a biology and anthropology background. So because I'm at a university, and a university that is teaching focused, I spend a lot of my life delivering lectures and mentoring students, and that's really nice. I also don't, I think, spend enough time outside for somebody who's supposed to understand the environment, or spend enough time in the lab. But I do try to get those skills always happening with my students, and so it means that we go out, we take courses, we do some really great lab things in teaching sessions. I get to supervise dissertation students, but would I like to spend more of my time doing that? Absolutely. So yes, that's sort of a day-to-day scenario. Today was a lot of answering emails and getting ready for this talk, for example.
So back to Gustav, another question is, are there situations where afforestation can increase albedo, or where deforestation can decrease albedo?
I don't think so, but I mean, and now I don't know this, but of course that could be some particular plant that has an unexpected albedo. But I mean, on the general scale, if you just compare forest with open land or grassland, then the albedo is higher for the open landscapes. But please correct me if I'm wrong, if someone in the audience knows this, or I have an example of this.
So another question from the Q&A box. Is it possible to approach on paleoclimate rain patterns in understanding the regional cultural relation solution of management the floods area, as channels like Amazons can be found in Mexican, I can't read, or Colombian chameleons of muscas. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce correctly. I think it's too brown.
Yes. So basically, these cultivation systems of the Americas can, if I'm understanding the question properly, can we just look at how they have varied in time and space as a means of understanding how rainfall has changed in the past? I think my answer to that would be I'm not sure why we necessarily would approach it from that direction when people are enormously complicated, and there are other choices that are happening besides just managing climate in how we use the land. I don't always want to give that answer of, and there are cultural aspects of it, just to explain the things that we don't understand why people did things in the past, but that fundamentally is true. People are making really complex decisions. So where we have such excellent things like speleothem records, and geochemical signatures of precipitation change in lakes, I would always look to those, which are much simpler systems. I don't want to call people systems, but they're much simpler and more predictably responding. And then we can then use that to understand these systems and people and how they've chosen to manage these particular environmental pressures.
So, but following what you are saying, could the ice cores in the Andes provide you with some information besides the speleothems?
Yes, they do. I think the problem that we have in lowland Amazonia right now is that we just need more records, and they are out there. It's just a matter of investigator effort at some point. So we have relied on high Andean records where we're thinking, are those climate linkages as tight as they should be, when actually we just need to increase our investigative effort and get many more Amazonian records. That is my answer. Yeah.
Great. Erin, have you any questions?
Yeah, well, I had a question for Gustav around the way that you've compared, I guess, the impact of humans on the landscape, and whether your predictions from the model, is it possible to align them with archaeological evidence, or to use the archaeological evidence as a kind of test, or are you kind of comparing two things that are not related?
No, I think you could do that, and I mean that would be the next step, so to speak. So because then you can identify the regions where we know that there was activity going on. So for example, we see signals in Scandinavia between the simulation, but we know that this is not because of anthropogenic activity. So that would be nice to actually be able to pinpoint that. And then again, in these in the KK10 land cover description, that is based on archaeology evidence also. So you have it that way also. But that is one of many lines of evidence in that. But yes.
Yeah, I had wondered if an issue might be to do with scale, because I think a lot of your grid boxes or your the resolution of your models looks to be much larger than what might be going on the fine scale. So is it possible to reconcile those?
Well, to some extent, because I suppose that if you have archaeological evidence, that maybe even if you have it at one site, maybe that there was a region with a settlement or people living in that, and that size of that may be comparable to the grid box's size. That is a couple of tenths of kilometers. So yeah.
Denise, is it okay if I ask Bronwyn a question as well?
Yeah,
sometime. Yeah, Bronwyn, I had a question about when you're showing the impact of that final system, which is affected by seasonal flooding. So do you think the important factor for these landscapes is around changes in the baseline, that it's getting broadly wetter or broadly drier? Or is there any role in the variability that's sort of superimposed on that baseline change? Is that something you can tease apart in the records?
Not yet. That is the ideal. I think predictability of the flood is probably what people really need on a daily basis. When you have a really, really heavy flood season versus a very heavy drought season, and if those are unpredicted, then they might be much more difficult to manage. So no, I think that is something that would be absolutely excellent to get out of our records, but so much of the sediment records in the lowlands of the Amazon are the sedimentation rates are so low that even getting the 100-year temporal resolution is so difficult. So it is something to approach and to think about. And so when I'm talking about changes in flooding, generally I'm talking about the mean level of flood. But I expect there's an element of predictability around that as well, that having a diversity of resources and ability to use different resources is absolutely crucial to managing those more unpredictable years.
Great, thanks. Do you have any comments, Denny?
No, but I have questions about about both of the speakers. Back to Gustav, you are speaking about pollen and your reconstruction, but and vegetation. So can you explain how are you making the link between the pollen data and the vegetation reconstruction in your model?
I can try. This is not my expertise, but what you do is you drill a core in the sediment in a lake, and then you get this sediment core, and then you look at the layers, what kind of pollen you find in each layer, and then you have some kind of function for knowing the dispersion of different types of pollen, and from that you can reconstruct the vegetation, and then you only get the pointwise, but we want a gridded data set to use in the model, and then we use statistical models to fill the gaps between the sites. So that's basically how it works.
It was just for the general audience, you know.
Yeah. No, it's a good point.
And about Bronwyn, in several of your summaries, you are speaking for the Maya, the evidence of forest conservation under climate stress. And for the last example, you speak about flexible and adaptative strategies during period of past climate change. How can you compare with what's happening those days, nowadays, in South America, especially with the Amazon forest?
Yeah, no, that is a really good point. And in fact, somebody's just popped up in the web chat asking a very similar question. I think that is the answer, as we decolonize the geosciences and we enable people to speak for themselves and to forefront some of these practices. As far as what's happening now, yes, we are heading into non-analog territory. I mean, we have disrupted so much of the hydrological cycle in the Amazon around the edges of it. We have stopped people from doing traditional polyculture in many of parts of the Amazon. We've railroaded the Amazon rainforest for soybean production. These are non-analog situations, and of course, climate's just getting hotter. But it's that same argument can be made across the world. Like, you know, we're heading into non-analog situations everywhere. And so understanding the role of land use and land cover, like Gustav has made that point brilliantly, and encouraging people to be more, sorry, not encouraging them to be vocal, giving people the space to talk about their own polyculture systems and what they know works is really important, and we have to listen. And I do appreciate the fact that I'm coming at this from a very Western perspective, and that I am a paleoecologist who's speaking for people in the past in a completely different part of the world, and it is a bit of a frustration that this is still where so much of this information is coming from, but we're seeing more more modern studies and more data coming out on polyculture systems and the importance of its use, and some of that is based on, well, we know, or we believe that it was resilient in the past.
So this is a question which was mostly on the Q&A box. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So Erin, back to you.
Yeah, so I think we have no further questions in the Q&A, and yeah, I think this has been a great discussion already. So I'll bring it to a close really just by thanking you again, Gustav and Bronwyn, for your really stimulating presentations and your comments in answer to the Q&A. And thank you all in the audience for also attending and providing those questions. It's been a great discussion. Before I conclude, I'd like to remind you that the webinar series is being recorded and all of the webinars are made available on the EGU's dedicated page. The next webinar is scheduled next week, Tuesday, November 25th at 11 p.m. CEST. And this lecture will focus on past ocean circulation and climate change, and will feature 2 exciting presentations by Helen Bostock and Sam Sheriff-Tadano. The registration is still open on the Climate of the Past webpage. So we look forward to seeing you all then, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.